All right, let's get into it. We all have this picture in our heads of how farming started, right? Someone, somewhere, plants a seed, and poof, the world changes forever. But the story of how we even know that story, well, that's just as fascinating. It's a real-life tale of brilliant pioneers, clashing theories, and huge global events that basically cast a shadow over half the story for 50 years. Today, we're pulling that shadow back. So we all recognize this place, the Fertile Crescent. It's that huge arc of land from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the so-called cradle of civilization. It's kind of the superstar of ancient history. But what's so wild is that for decades, the entire archaeological world was laser-focused on one part of this cradle, while another, equally important region was pretty much forgotten. And the big question is, why? To really get this, we have to stop thinking of the Fertile Crescent as just one big place. We need to see it as two separate heartlands, and each one has its own unique story to tell. Okay, so on your left, you've got the Eastern Fertile Crescent. Think rugged foothills, the Zagros and Taurus Mountains in what's now Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. Then on the right, you have the Western Fertile Crescent, what we call the Levant, so modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon. For a long, long time, we knew they were two parts of a whole, but they had really distinct cultural traditions. And for most of the 20th century, only one of them was going to be the star of the show. Yeah, by the time we got to the late 20th century, the academic consensus was pretty much set in stone. The real action, the big ideas, all the innovations that led to farming happened in the West. And the East, it was just seen as a follower, a slow, kind of boring backwater that eventually got around to farming after everyone else had figured it out. But, and this is the big twist, that wasn't always the story, not even close. Before the West ever took the spotlight, the first real scientific hunt for where agriculture began started somewhere else entirely. It started in the East. And that whole search was spearheaded by this one incredible archaeologist, Robert Braidwood, who came up with an idea that was, frankly, revolutionary. So this slide really shows a huge clash of ideas. For ages, the main explanation was something called the oasis theory. The idea was that after the Ice Age, a massive drought pushed people, plants, and animals all together into these shrinking oases, which forced them into this close relationship that led to farming. But Braidwood thought that was totally backward. He just asked a simple, common-sense question. Why don't we look for the origins of farming where the wild ancestors of our first crops and animals actually lived? He called this place the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, the foothills of the Zagros and Taurus Mountains. And Braidwood didn't just have a new theory, he had a whole new way of doing archaeology. This was a game changer. He put together the first ever multidisciplinary teams, bringing in geologists to study climate, botanists to figure out the plants, and zoologists for the animal bones. He was one of the very first to use the brand new cutting-edge technology of radiocarbon dating. His work was so groundbreaking that he got the first National Science Foundation grant ever given to an archaeologist. The guy was literally changing the entire field. So what was Braidwood's big takeaway from all this research? He argued that some big climate event, like a drought, didn't kickstart agriculture. In fact, the climate had been pretty great for thousands of years. The real trigger, he said, was human development. People just needed time to get good at it, to experiment, to develop the right tools and the right knowledge. As he famously put it, farming didn't happen any sooner because culture was not yet ready to achieve it. Braidwood's work in the East had totally established it as the place to look for farming's origins. But then, the story takes this incredibly sharp turn, and not because of some new discovery, but because of what was happening out in the world. It all kind of happened in stages. In the 1950s, Braidwood and his teams were doing amazing work in Iraq. But then, in 1958, political instability made it totally impossible for them to go back. So, he pivoted, moved his work over to neighboring Iran. But by the late 1970s, the Iranian Revolution closed that region off too, to most Western archaeologists. One by one, the doors to the Eastern Fertile Crescent were just slamming shut. And the result was immediate, and honestly, dramatic. Archaeologists couldn't work in the East anymore, so they went where they could, to the West, in the Levant. The scientific spotlight didn't move because of some brilliant new idea, it was literally forced to move by geopolitics. And with this new focus on a new place came a whole new story, and a new scientific debate that would define archaeology for decades. So with decades of intense research happening in the West, and a complete and total lack of new information coming out of the East, the whole narrative started to flip on its head. Suddenly, the West looked like the dynamic, innovative core, the true birthplace of farming. In the East, The very region Braidwood had championed was now being painted as that passive backwater we talked about. Now, during this time, a major new theory came along to challenge Braidwood, led by an archaeologist named Lewis Binford. He argued that hunter-gatherers actually had it pretty good. He called them the original affluent society, and they would never switch to the back-breaking labor of farming unless they were absolutely forced to. And that force, he said, was population pressure. Too many mouths to feed. And this, right here, this gets to the very heart of the great debate. Was farming an internal process, something driven by human smarts and cultural readiness, like Braidwood argued, or was it an external force, a reluctant reaction to population pressure, like Binford proposed? With all this new data pouring in from the West, Binford's external pressure idea started to gain a ton of traction. So that's pretty much where things stood for nearly 30 years. An entire scientific story completely shaped by where researchers could, and more importantly, could not dig. The East, the original focus, the place where the search for farming's origins began, it basically became a ghost story. An entire region packed with history and answers was just off the map, sitting there in the dark. And listen, this is the most important thing to remember. All those theories about the East being a backwater, they were built on an absence of evidence, not evidence of absence. Nobody ever actually proved Braidwood's original findings wrong. The research was simply interrupted. The story was put on pause. Until the early 2000s. As political situations slowly started to change, archaeologists finally started making their way back to the Zagros Mountains in Iraq and Iran. And they were armed with brand new technologies and totally new questions. A whole new generation was about to press play on that paused story. So what happens when decades of assumptions are suddenly blasted with a flood of new evidence? What secrets has that forgotten heartland been keeping all this time? And what does it teach us about how easily the stories we tell about our own past can be warped by the politics of the present? Because let me tell you, this story is far from over.